right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Session 2 panel, or workshop, I'm sorry. We are here today with Jamila Rakib, and today's Sustaining Peace Forum is sponsored by the MDI-CCCR, the AC4, the NECR Master's Program, as well as CGAG and the Tamer Center here at Columbia. I will leave it to you to consult your lovely programs to decipher that alphabet soup, and please learn more about and ways to connect with us. I won't waste any of our precious time reading Jamila's impressive bio, but I do encourage you to read that within. But please rest assured that we're within the hands of an expert with deep expertise in training, research, and connections. Her goal is to connect global strivers, people who are resisting nonviolently against oppression, dictatorship, and systemic violence throughout the world. She will lead us today through an exercise in a series of discussions in order to learn from our global counterparts, to better navigate the current political situation that we're finding ourselves here in the United States. How can we strategically work together to protect those most vulnerable amongst us and to hold true to the core values that we cherish? How can we recognize and strengthen our common humanity? What systemic and complex changes must we enact for today, for the next 4 years, and for years to come? I look forward to learning and discussing with you.
Awesome. I'm going to try to do without this. Let's see. Okay. Hello, everyone. Such an honor to be here. I'm going to try to speak without a mic, so maybe you can, once I emerge from the podium, maybe you can let me know whether everyone can hear me. Everyone in the back? Okay. So if at any point you'd like me to speak up, then please let me know to do that. Again, thank you so much to you all. It's great to be here. It's an amazing crowd here, and I think an indication of the challenges that people recognize that we face in our society, and also a lot of amazing energy that exists at this moment by people who recognize that there's a lot that as individuals we can do to try to impact our society, to defend the institutions and the values that we find important in our society. So it's great to be here. And I just want to say thank you very much to the team, to the Sustaining Peace Forum team for all of your help in arranging this. I hope that today we can together uncover some insight that can help us all to conduct our work and to deal effectively with the challenges that we face. I'm confident that there is an enormous amount of insight and experience in this room from which we can all learn. So I hope everyone will feel very free to speak up. So this brings me to the goals of the workshop. As you may know, I've been studying nonviolent resistance and working with the groups using it for a long time, since 2002, sort of my first real job after college. And the process of learning how the technique operates and how it can be used and applied effectively by organizers and activists, and how it can be studied more effectively by scholars, is something that we're all still learning about. The field is really underdeveloped. We have societies around the world that favor the history of war and violence, and so this powerful means of action that has been used for thousands of years is still very much neglected, both by policymakers and universities. And so this is a unique moment in which people recognize that something more needs to be done to understand the technique better. I think efforts like this are part of that. Say that, I'm not here to dispense any special wisdom. I'd like to learn from all of you also. Also on how best to convey this knowledge, which we've collected over, the course of many years, but still, there's a lot of work to be done. So I recently gave a few talks in London, and this morning I received this. So I share this with you to tell you about really what this work does for people as I've observed it, which is that it doesn't give specific instructions or advice or tell you what to do. In fact, if anything, maybe it brings up more questions, but questions that we normally don't think about. And it provides people a framework to think about the problems and how they might be addressed using the lessons that are distilled from, as I mentioned, perhaps thousands of years of history, and also understanding about what activists are doing around the world today. So, in the short time that we have together, I'd like to at least explain what nonviolent action is, give a basic introduction because it carries so many misconceptions, talk about some of the factors that contribute to effectiveness, and very importantly, to convey the importance of planning and preparation. And also to, again, learn about your work and activities. And I hope the workshop will leave you with knowledge of movements and actions that can not only help inspire you, but also inform your own thinking. So also I hope the conversation can be informal. We're a large group, but I hope everyone will feel free to speak up, to share your own experiences, and to ask questions when you'd like. As I mentioned, the topic, nonviolent resistance, carries a lot of misconceptions. And I think probably even in this room, we have multiple definitions and understandings of the concept and the means of action, which I think is a problem because oftentimes it leads to this lack of clarity, and the lack of clarity we think is a barrier for clear thinking and also effective action. So I'd like to get a sense of how you understand, or at least some of you understands nonviolent resistance, what you think that it is, the technique, and also maybe to get a sense of why you've joined us today. There's obviously so much to cover here, and I'd like to share what I know that's meaningful and useful, but it would be interesting to know where everyone is, or at least some of you, and perhaps that could be used as a basis of tailoring the conversation also. So can anyone share with us, maybe perhaps tell us your name and anything you'd like to share about your background, and also how you understand nonviolent resistance and what you hope to learn today. Oh, it's all up there. Yes.
I'm Carla Rasmussen, and I work with indigenous tribes for economic empowerment and the Brazilian Amazon. Thank you. And I also started a Love Parade in New York City. That'll be on April 30th. So I'm interested in nonviolence as it, instead of coming away from violence, how can we move towards unity and peace? I feel like those are two different actions, like moving away from violence and then moving towards peace. Maybe it has a different energy to it, or it's a different intention when you do it.
That's great, thank you.
My name is Jochen Weber. I work in the psychology department here, and over the last couple of weeks had several conversations with friends and colleagues related to some of the political and ideological impact and fallout from the last year's election, and then specifically thinking of how, for instance, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X differed in their approach as to how much violence should or should not be part of protest.
I'm Christopher Salata. I'm the founder of an organization called the Peace Accelerators, and I'm interested in learning the kind of the first initial points of activism that create a much larger activism trend, kind of like the ripple effect, things like Rosa Parks maybe in the civil rights movement, but things that have happened nationally similar to that, what those first entry points were that ignited other people to then all take action as well.
Anybody else like to share any of their goals?
Hi, my name is Carolina. I'm from Colombia. I was a student here until a couple months ago. I just graduated from the NECR program. And actually, I was looking at this sheet and the citizens' alternatives to obedience, reluctant and slow compliance. That's Colombian culture. Like we do that all the time. So it would be very interesting to see like what is the reach of that type of behavior and how it can inspire change because it's something that is very very needed in Latin America right now.
Great, thank you. One more? Great.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michelle Arbid, also a graduate of NECR. My background and kind of focus is on psychology, the psychology of conflict, and kind of the neuropsychology underneath all of that. And what I'm really interested in relation to this topic is mimetics and the spread of violent versus nonviolent components and how those become internalized and socialized into society, and what tools maybe we can identify individually and collectively to better embed those concepts and better socialize those concepts between one another.
If you're still soliciting.
Sure, we'll-
I'm Claudia Cohen. I teach in the social organizational program at Teachers College. I teach a course on managing conflict. And I've been interested in conflict and conflict resolution and tilting toward peaceful, certainly for a very long time. But as was mentioned in the current socio-political context, I'm interested in the strategies for creating actions. There are, so many different individual actions, but how do you strategize around which constellation of actions would you organize together to get your point across? And what are the strategies around communicating a message and preparing to resist if you need to? Many of these strategies appear to be where you're initiating it yourself, and I didn't look at all of them in detail, but I'm also interested in those where, a confrontation between police and protesters, that kind of resistance also.
Great. Would you mind holding your comments? Or? Okay.
My name is Fritz. I'm a librarian here at Columbia. I was formerly a librarian at a nonviolence resource center in Montreal. And I was able to see from my time in Montreal things on this list which definitely are part of the acceptable practices of French-speaking cultures, of the culture of Quebec and the culture of France. And I'm wondering specifically what you think might be culturally acceptable, possible, and what might grow some roots in the United States, which is a very different culture where different practices are acceptable.
I heard a question there, and I think hopefully we can address that, during our discussion. I think it's a very important question you ask, and also one that I think many people could contribute to that conversation. I'm certainly no expert on U.S. society, but we don't place a strong emphasis on culture necessarily in terms of whether precluding certain methods or the fact that whether people can take action effectively, work together. We think that humans in general have a capacity to do that, and certainly that can be learned. So specific methods obviously may work better in various societies. But I think much of what was raised just now speaks to the kind of complexity of nonviolent resistance. and the need for greater learning and that action is made more effective by understanding many of these issues and thinking them through. And I hope we can do some of that today. And in terms of learning, there's a film made about the work of Gene Sharp called "How to Start a Revolution," and I'm gonna ask some of my colleagues here. Should I skip that or should we just go for it? Okay, I'll just tell you quickly. It's called How to Start a Revolution. We'll actually skip watching the trailer for it. But this is a film that was made during the Arab Spring in the sort of years preceding, before 2011. And it's played a major role in bringing attention to nonviolent resistance and also has shown sort of the global spread of the work. I'd like to define what we mean by nonviolent resistance because we've been very careful with terminology. I'm going to speak a bit about my colleague and mentor, Gene Sharp, who's really the father of the field of nonviolent resistance. And even back in the 50s, he recognized the need for clear language. He said, just like with other fields, we can't make up our own words. We can't make up our own language. And there's a need to have clarity there. So nonviolent resistance is called also civil resistance or people power. It's collective action, and it's taken by groups to either challenge particular systems, regimes, or policies, or to defend them. When the action is conducted outside of conventional politics and institutions without violence or the threat of violence, then the action falls into the category of nonviolent resistance. It's not linked to a belief system or a principled rejection of violence on moral grounds. It's a pragmatic technique. It uses social, political, and economic forms of non-cooperation. And these tools, you have the 198 methods. You have the list there. These tools are meant to, again, either preserve systems or undermine them. So essentially, it's a way for people to seize political power and to deny it to others. They do that by either refusing to do things that are either expected or required either by law or by custom, or doing that which is forbidden. So the idea on which nonviolent resistance is based is the sort of fundamental piece of this is an understanding of power. We decided not to play that. We're going to have at least one or two technological mishaps today, I promise. So Gene Sharp didn't develop this theory of power. This is one that comes from classical political theorists. It's the idea that, whether we live in a democracy or an authoritarian system or something in between, people in power are not as powerful as they'd like us all to believe. And that they were not born with this power, that they get their power from various sources in society, and that even the most dictatorial system relies on cooperation and obedience from regular people, from institutions who help it to maintain power and to carry out its policies. And these sources of power can be identified. In most societies, they are the military, police, the religious institutions, the business elite, transportation workers, diplomats, labor unions, on and on. These sources of power can also be severed. These systems of power have weaknesses, and these weaknesses can be identified and aggravated. And, a lot of the work we do is to talk to people in many different societies who often feel very weak, and they say the opponent has all the power. But this type of analysis is actually very empowering because the power of the opponent and the power of the opposition movement is often not static. It has changed even in the course of a few years. And when this analysis is done, I think it identifies weaknesses and strengths that can be very illuminating in terms of figuring out what to do. When struggles are conducted with this understanding of power in mind, by people who have a plan, who can act with great courage, who know what to do, when to do it, and also who develop the capacity to withstand repression, because this is something we need to address today. That movements, when they become effective, are likely to face repression, sometimes very extreme, often unanticipated. And that can cause some severe problems in terms of a collapse of a movement. So this is why planning and preparation is so important, and in understanding that opponents will also often use the maximum level of violence they can get away with in order to make groups abandon their activities. So, as I said, I've been studying nonviolent resistance for a long time, and many people are surprised that I didn't come to the work as a believer in principled nonviolence. I came to it as someone who believed very strongly in the fundamental right of people to resist oppression. And that was because at the age of 4, I became a refugee of the Afghan war and grew up with this really glorified sense of resistance violence. Because that is what had supposedly liberated the country, obviously at huge cost. But that cost was seen as justified. In fact, even now it's considered justified by most Afghans and people around the world who see that war as a success, even at the loss of millions of lives, massive displacement, 40 years of conflict and destabilization of the entire region, and on, like destruction of the infrastructure, which led me to understand that violence, as terrible as we all know it to be, is continuously, supported and used by people for so-called good purposes. No one says what they're doing is, morally wrong necessarily. Most people justify the worst actions because they see that it's for the defense of communities and for people. So, in coming from that background, I found work that showed me actually there was this really powerful thing you can do, and it need not be doing nothing or using violence. And so I discovered the work of a man named Gene Sharp. Some of you may have heard his name before. He is now 89 years old. And since the 1950s, he's been studying nonviolent resistance and how people can make social and political change. And he began by sort of looking at the problems in the world, recognizing that he needed to do something, and not really quite knowing what to do. But started studying Gandhi, and then learned that actually what happened in the Indian independence movement was not necessarily because everyone believed the same thing. They still acted effectively, even though they didn't all have the same share a belief system, like a rejection of violence. Okay. He also learned that when people used nonviolent resistance, overwhelmingly they did it for pragmatic reasons. That they didn't do it because they were necessarily thought violence was morally wrong, but they actually thought that for some reason, for various reasons, it provided them some kind of an advantage. So he started studying historical cases, not just Gandhi and others, but also the sort of thousands of cases going back to 300 BC where people had used nonviolent action and non-cooperation, and in spite of the fact mostly they didn't know what they were doing, they were achieving amazing successes. So he thought, imagine if people had some understanding of how this technique operates. And so he started collecting that information. And he did that for many years. He came up with this 198 methods. And lots of books, perhaps more than 30 or more in English, and then thousands of pages of writing on this topic. He also founded the Albert Einstein Institution in 1983, and the institution was set up to do this research, understanding that nonviolent resistance is a technique that needs to continue to be refined, and that knowledge then needs to be shared with people so they can use it. And so the institution was set up to do that, and since then we have publications in many different languages, and I would invite you guys to check those out. And I joined the work, and since then, I've been able to observe a very, very interesting period in the use of this technique, in terms of the spread of the ideas. Because initially, the way we saw it happen was that activists would meet each other and they would share printed material. I mean, that sounds really old-fashioned right now, but it was a really, really important way that the information was initially spreading. You know, there would be somebody that would see the book in a bookstore, you know, one of our books in the bookstore window in Bangkok, take it to Indonesia, and then they would be translated there, and that's how it spread. But of course, now we have technology and social media and all of these incredible tools that have allowed the work to spread really not just incrementally, but more significantly. How are we doing for time? I've stopped advancing the slides. I hope nobody minds. Yeah. So the Arab Spring was a really interesting time for our work, and I think it was an interesting time for a lot of people who suddenly understood that, you know, the powerful, long entrenched leaders that people were waiting for them basically to die, that they were not as powerful as people thought, and that people in these societies were also not as weak as people thought. And the uprisings in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Syria, and Bahrain, and elsewhere really caught the imagination of people and created this sort of general euphoria. As people wanted to know, how does this apply to the issues that we care about? And we saw it here in the U.S. after, you know, during the sort of initial days of the uprisings. And a lot of people contacted us. They wanted to know, you know, how does this work in a society with more democratic freedoms? If your work is about, you know, undermining authoritarian systems, how does that apply to countries like the United States? How does it apply to non-state actors like corporations or armed groups? And then, of course, we've had a massive spike in interest since the inauguration. Here in the United States, it might be, in my memory, the sort of most interest domestically in this analysis and writings and the tools that we offer. I've seen a lot of new interest by people who want to know how they can employ their own skills and energies in order to participate in political action. And this is really interesting because, you know, it's not necessarily from activists. I'm sure everyone's seen, or many of you have seen this sign, but I've seen it in a number of protests where people recognize there's fundamental issues at stake, and that doing nothing and believing in the system and institutions to deliver the needs of your community and to defend your communities is perhaps not enough any longer. So obviously if you're all here, you're aware of some of the challenges that we face in our society. Did you say 3 minutes? Oh, it's 3 o'clock. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I find this topic very exciting, and as you can see, I have gone over my time already. I wanted to ask what your thinking has been since the inauguration. Perhaps we can save some of that for the discussion afterwards. I also was interested to know, you know, in this time, you know, one of the sentiments that I've seen expressed a lot is this huge energy to do something, and people saying, well, what exactly do we do? And presenting a lot of barriers to effective action, like people just don't care, you know, society is very fragmented, the media is, you know, is also under control of very few bodies. And people really feeling like they need to do something but not knowing exactly what to do to produce, not just to protest, but actually to produce real fundamental change. So I was hoping to hear from you, but I want to make sure, because we have an exercise that we'd like to do, and we'd like to split up into groups to do that. Is that feasible? And I see. Okay. Well, yeah. So, I don't need to tell you about what's happening in our country in terms of the large-scale protests that we've seen since the inauguration, and how those came about. But you may be aware that the big Women's March, the weekend after the inauguration, was actually in many ways appears to be quite spontaneous, in the sense that initially the person who called for that was a retired grandmother in Hawaii who wanted to get her friends to all travel to Washington, and then the next day 10,000 people had signed up just overnight while she was sleeping. And I think obviously the marches show that there's a great deal of dissatisfaction with the current rhetoric and the policies that are being presented. It's also a really impressive show of solidarity and of strength, and it's been hugely inspirational for many people. I don't want to reduce the sort of implications of that or understate them. But just to say they are just the first step in real and lasting change. And that what we've seen around the world is this perception that it is protest and going in the streets that really produces change. And I think this is a real problem because whether it's here in the United States or elsewhere, I think perhaps one of the misconceptions that came out of the Arab Spring, and also because of what the media can capture, it's really the action that takes place publicly. But what we know to be true is that what's actually happening is that many of these movements are not spontaneous, that they build on a lot of organizing and networking that happens sometimes for decades, and that there's often a lot of strategic planning, definitely tactical planning, and that people are learning and organizing, and that there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes action going on. And so that's something I think people need to understand, because at the end, demonstrations are symbolic actions. They communicate that X number of people are dissatisfied with a particular policy. But on their own, they're pretty mild. And what's really essential is the tough part, which is the institutional building. So we have an exercise that speaks to that. And so I'd just like to just try to introduce that exercise so we know what we need to do. A trend we've seen around the world is that people are understandably very impatient to produce change in their societies, and often the way they view it is that they need to undermine a system, attack it, and that then they don't often think about what comes next or what should replace that. So what you see around the world is often the undermining of systems and the weakening of systems, but not the tough part of institution building. Often people recognize that they have to take action. They often recognize it when they're already in the middle of a crisis. And so this is what we get a lot. There's a fraud committed, what do we do? Or we've just uncovered massive corruption. How do we bring attention to it? How do we stop it? And this ignores a very crucial part of nonviolent resistance, which is, again, the capacity building piece of it, which should happen which should be almost a prerequisite to taking action. So there's lots of great examples of institution building, from the apartheid movement, from the Indian independence movement. In fact, in the context of the Indian independence movement, Gandhi called this constructive programs. And he said that in order to foster self-reliant communities, in order to prepare people to take action, and in order to defend the victories, that there needed to be this sort of constructive program. And constructive programs, he said, were networks of people that got together to figure out their problems, how they could meet the needs of their community, perhaps not even asking anything of the government or the opponent, but recognizing there is this need, and what resources do we have within our community? What resources can we get in order to maybe do something very basic, but very important? And these very basic kinds of needs, which were sometimes representative of wider injustices, were a really, really effective way to communicate not just what you're against, but what kind of values and what kind of qualities that you want. Gandhi said that attempting nonviolent resistance without a constructive program was like asking a paralyzed hand to lift a spoon. And he also said that independence, if he was handed independence on a silver platter, he wouldn't want it, because just achieving particular victories leaves people as helpless as they were before. And this type of institution building, this type of networking is really such a critical piece of, again, effective resistance and also social and political empowerment. And the good news is I'm sure all of you have also observed some really incredible examples of this in our society that have really emerged in recent months. And so I wanted to quickly talk about what some of those were, not talk, but maybe stop talking and show you. And then perhaps they can be sort of a way to provoke your own thinking about examples of this that you've either seen in your own communities, or ones you've participated in, or ones you've helped develop. And perhaps, then, when we go into the breakout, you could talk about, how this type of thinking, this approach could be applied to try to develop some of these networks in your own communities. So, oh goodness. So, okay. So this is an article in the Times from a few weeks ago about these, I don't know if anyone saw it, but I thought it was quite amazing. It talks about sort of the history of how organizing has happened out of people's living rooms and places of work and their schools and their places of worship, and how this is emerging today as there are so many people who are not necessarily activists, but regular people who are saying, okay, at least we get together, eat, perhaps enjoy a glass of wine, and talk about the issues that are important to us, perhaps in our neighborhoods. We don't have to think about overturning the whole system, but maybe we start very small and we figure out how we meet the needs of maybe, our street. And so they're doing this sort of thing. I'm in touch with quite a number of them. And it starts with a casserole can be a potent weapon, which I thought was a cool way to start the article. But anyway, they invite people from their communities that are vulnerable and talk about how how to help them, including undocumented citizens. And it's not just talking about the problems, but how they might act together. So it's building these networks that are really important because they can be activated in times of a crisis, and they can be there. Perhaps they're not going to be needed today or tomorrow, but eventually, it's likely that they will. So there's one, and anyway, some of the resources that I speak about, I'm gonna send them to our organizers, and so if you want to look at any of these, I'll have them available, or they will be available later. I think you guys must have heard about this one. There's also some interesting lines that these individuals before inauguration suspected that the data on the EPA website was going to be removed from public access, so they decided to preserve it. And, not to protest the removal, but to make sure it was going to be available for the rest of us in the future. And I think this type of thinking is really encouraging. And people recognizing that they don't need to focus on intentions of their opponents, but really on their capacities. So if it's possible, then you can assume that it could be attempted at least. And so this type of action is almost in many ways a deterrent to a future aggression. And I think this is exciting. I'm sure you guys also heard about this. Okay, last one. Okay, so anyway, I'm sure you heard about the rogue accounts, the EPA rogue and the National Park Service, and how the National Park Service account has, like, 4 times as many followers as the real one. And then again, planning and preparation, and the fact that people are recognizing that they need to learn about civil disobedience, how it's been used, how it can be employed, and the fact that federal employees are now taking part in workshops, perhaps similar to what we're doing here today. And I think this is extremely positive because, it may be that they don't need to employ these kinds of efforts, but that as a society, we're becoming more educated on the importance of civil disobedience and how that actually strengthens our democratic institutions and doesn't undermine them. Then I think that's a really, really positive message that people are learning. So I'll stop there. And would someone like to instruct the group? Yeah, we're aware that people might need to rush off any moment. So then I just wanted to make sure if anyone has any follow-up conversation, I'll definitely be around here for a few more minutes after that. So I hope you all had a nice conversation. I wish we had more time, but I would like to hear from at least a few of you about what you spoke about and whether there's anything you'd like to share with the larger group. So if you could just tell us about, maybe one example, either something you've observed or an idea that you all sort of collectively came up with. Yes.
Okay, I'll start. I don't need the mic.
For the recording, if you don't mind.
Okay, so I will stay the mic. My name is Corey Riggs, and I was recently accepted to the master program here, and so I'm evaluating whether to attend or not. So that's why I'm here today. From our group, I thought one of the big takeaways was it seems like there's a lot of groups that do performance art and kind of show people the conflict resolution and not just teach it. And so really show ways of how they do it. So there was a couple examples here, ICE from Queens, right? That's the name. And Forum Theater. And then the other takeaway was the really, even though there's big protests or there's big things that happen, that the most important thing is the one-on-one communication at those protests to keep it going afterwards. And also that you don't have to go home and create a whole new group. There's probably a group that already exists that you could put your energy towards. So that was what we came up with.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great point. The piece that this is not just about building institutions, but strengthening the existing ones as well.
I think our group talked about certain historic events where nonviolent action was taken, and I think for us, one of the big points was that people should be aware of the consequences of their action and really anticipate what the return action from the system will be, and then so to use these different 198 tactics or steps into an embedded strategy to really think about what is our goal, who and what institution are we kind of up against, and what will come back if we do this or that.
Yeah. I don't think I need that. Yeah, such an important point and such an important piece of this work, the need for strategic planning, and that a good strategy is based on a lot of information and knowledge, understanding about your own society, your strengths and weaknesses, those of your opponent, of different players in society, and also understanding about nonviolent resistance and how it works. So in this time we've focused mainly on knowledge of nonviolent resistance, but the strategic planning piece is really key. There's lots of resources on how you might begin to develop one, and it's tough work, but there are steps in doing so. And so this list of 198 methods is meant to kind of convey the diversity of specific actions that you can take. They're not steps, you don't go through them one by one. There are ones that will not be suitable depending on the situation, and you don't pick them based on what you feel like doing. You pick them based on what your objectives are and what's likely to lead you closer to your objectives. And so that's really, really important. There's things that won't be relevant I invite you to look up this hologram protest. I watch the video, like once a week just to give me inspiration, and it's really awesome. So method 199, hologram protest. Thank you. Yes, please.
In our group, we discussed a lot about kind of the dissemination of information and the transformation of different movements, and kind of raising questions about to what extent does the set of principles or beliefs or underlying values need to be delineated in order for a movement to be constructive, and where does institution kind of come into that was a big part of our discussion.
Yeah, again, great question. I think there's so much about the sort of society we live in where the messaging is so important, making clear that you need to articulate that vision and that message. Otherwise, it can be, it can be distracted from. And also, sometimes opponents are very, very good at articulating messages, and often opposition movements are sometimes a little less clear, so the clarity is very key. And articulating a message that is likely to build the movement and to draw in more supporters, and how to do that. There are ways to do that as well, and there are people who have done a lot of work on that specific topic. So thanks for sharing. And we're it sounds like we're done. Did someone have a burning thought to share?